This leads me on to, before I continue, clearly that Adolf Hitler was trying to fuse Germany together away from a federal system in effect. He did put Gauleiters or governors into the various regions of Germany, but he was trying to model Germany on the British Empire, in its way of operating, in having a fused system between the executive and the parliament, the legislature. It did not regard the aristocracy as a threat because, of course, the revolutions after the First World War got rid of the aristocracy and put in a presidential system, of which Hindenburg was president and Adolf Hitler was chancellor, and then Adolf Hitler assumed the role of Führer by both threat and vote. The Austrian monarchist Erich von Kuller-Leden proposed that the 25-point programme was pro-Labour. The programme champions the right to employment, called for the institutions of profit sharing, confiscation of war profits, prosecution of usurers and profiteers. Now, usury is lending people money and extracting their wages as credit. It is basically what the financial system of today is based on. And usurers and profiteers. Nationalisation of trusts, commercialisation of communalisation of department stores, extension of the old age pension system, creation of a national education programme for all classes, prohibition of child labour, and an end to the dominance of investment capital. Whereas historian William Brustein proposes that the programme said points, and party founder Anton Dexter's statements indicated that the Nazi Party originated as a working class political party. In the course of pursuing public office, the agrarian failures of the 1920s prompted Hitler to further explain the true meaning of Point 17, land reform, legal land exploration for public utility, abolishment of land value tax, and prescription of land speculation, in the hope of winning farmers' votes in the May 1928 elections. Hitler disguised the implicit contradictions of Point 17 of the National Socialist programme by explaining the gratuitous exploration concerns only the creation of legal opportunities to explorate. If necessary, land which had been illegally acquired or is not administered from the viewpoint of the national welfare. This is directed primarily against Jewish land speculation companies. That was Adolf Hitler's words. Moreover, throughout the 1920s, over other members of the National Socialist German Workers' Party, seeking ideological consistency, sought either to change or to replace the National Socialist programme. In 1924, the economist Gottfried Frege proposed a 39-point programme retaining some of the original policies and introducing new policies. Hitler suppressed every instance of pragmatic change by refusing to broach the matters after 1925 because the National Socialist programme was inviolable, hence immutable. Simultaneously, however, he did not publicly support it in his political biography Mein Kampf. Now, in Mein Kampf, he did mention that the unions had an inalienable right to strike, which of course many socialist people within the Labour Party at the same time were against, including Clement Attlee. And Labour organisations did continue during the National Socialist government, despite the fact that Adolf Hitler banned the Communist Party, but he apologised for that to German workers. Saw that on a newsreel. Now, Hitler only mentions it as a so-called program of the movement in the 25-point plan. The historian Henry H. Turner proposes that many of the program's policies for economic reform, pro-labour legislation, popular democratic politics contradicted Adolf Hitler's basis of his dictatorial ambition. That the land reform and the antitrust legislation especially threatened the financial interests of the businessmen whom Hitler counted on for his political campaign money. But were those businessmen, I ask, subordinating their own self-interests, because that's a very capitalist argument there, to a overall ideological National Socialist idea? That's an interesting question to ask, I believe. Because Hitler could not safely discard the National Socialist program in the Nazi Party without provoking voter mutinies, Adolf Hitler, by force of personality, definitively closed all such ideological discussions. Now, the economy of Nazi Germany. What is the context of this? Well, during the time of the 1929 Depression, economists such as John Maynard Keynes. Now, I'm not saying that John Maynard Keynes was a National Socialist. He was a Fabian incrementalist, quite different. Still on the left. But he noted that government spending was perhaps the only way to stop the 1929 Depression. Now, although the Federal Reserve did exist in 1929, from 1913 to 1929, it did not spend any money to get the economy going. The United States was still on the gold standard, Britain was still on the gold standard, and Britain controlled the gold standard. This for Hitler was one of the major reasons why Germany needed to get off the gold standard, to have control over its own money. From his point of view, whether that money would lose its value, the Reichmark would lose its value through the use of the printing press and inflation will be discussed later on. But Keynes argued that because the United States didn't act until there was a threat of war, and Roosevelt didn't act until there was a threat of war, to boost GDP through spending on weaponry, because the Americans were rearming, everyone was rearming during the 1930s, and you cannot simply blame Nazi Germany or Japan for rearming, because what is the context of their rearmament? You could say that it is expansionary or aggressive. Surely it was. But it can also be argued that in Nazi Germany's case especially, it could have been defensive. Why? Because the hegemony of France over Western Europe and the hegemony of the Soviet Union over Eastern Europe, the Soviet Union was spending more money on armaments than all the rest of the world combined. The Soviet Union, when Germany had an army of just 200,000 men, had an army of 32 million men. The Soviet Union had an army of 32 million men. So and they were producing 30,000 tanks a year. Later on, when their weapons were actually better than the Germans' weapons, in the case of the T-34 tank, for instance, in terms of reliability, in ability to be produced, was a better vehicle than many of the German vehicles of the time, such as the Panzer III. Much better vehicle, and they were producing 30,000 of them a year. So the overall expansion of Soviet armaments just continued throughout the war, and the Soviets had a plan to attack Germany and Poland long before the Germans had a plan to do the same, in reverse, and attack Poland and attack the Soviet Union.